Good evening and welcome to the 2017 opening Convocation. The academic year is punctuated by ceremonies. We are a tradition-loving people, and this is one of my favorites. I'm pleased to celebrate it here with you at Washington and Lee for the first time. Convocation is literally a calling together, not merely in the ordinary sense that we're called together when we board an airplane, but in the special sense that we're called together to reassemble ourselves as a community. In the summer months, we're dispersed. The students travel far and wide, the faculty immerse themselves in their research, and the staff accomplish projects that can only be done when the students and the faculty are out of the way. Each of us is busy, productive, grateful for the change of pace and season, and yet there's something missing, something that impels us toward this moment when summer transitions into fall. As students, as teachers, and as staff devoted to providing an environment in which teaching and learning can take place, our avocations, that which we are called to do, require our convocation, our being called together. None of us can be truly who we are individually without all of us being here together. Which is why this time of year feels so right and so good. We are once again able to be our best selves. This was evident last weekend on Move-In Day, which is the informal cousin of Convocation. The first-year students were excited, a little bit nervous. The returning students were exuberant, overflowing with their love of this place and of each other and of the opportunity to share it with the new arrivals. Convocation is like Move-In Day with fancy gowns and funny hats, and when it rains with umbrellas. Convocation emphasizes and celebrates the fact that we are an academic community and that our distinctively academic work, with its attendant rhythms, challenges, and pleasures, has commenced. Classes begin at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, unless you're a law student, in which I hope you've been going to class for the last few weeks. The centerpiece of this ceremony and the kickoff to our year is the address that will be delivered by our distinguished guest, Danielle Allen. She will be properly introduced momentarily, but I can't help saying a few words myself about how ideal she is for this occasion and how personally excited I am to have her at W&L. Last night I led, as did many of you, a group of first-year students in a discussion of her book, Our Declaration. And if you have not yet read it, run to get yourself a copy after the ceremony. The book is a love poem to the art of slow reading, to learning to savor delectable word choice and precise expression, to learning to practice judicious interpretation, to learning to marvel at the persuasive power that results when rhetorical craft is harnessed to evidence and logic. The book is also an ode to the notion that such skill with facts, concepts, inferences, and words is indispensable to democracy, which is indispensable to humanity. It is enough to make a philosopher turned university president weep for joy. Danielle Allen makes clear what is at stake in our work here every day, work that never truly stops, but which officially recommences right now. The occasion is momentous enough that it calls for appropriate music, which we can always count on the university singers to provide. They and their director, Dr. Shane Lynch, choose their pieces carefully. Since this is my first full year at W&L, they would like to help start it off with a bang by performing a classic and loud choral celebration, the third movement of F. Melius Christensen's Psalm 50. Dr. Lynch and the university singers, please take it away. Thank you to the university singers and to Professor Lynch. It is now my privilege to turn the lectern over to Mark Connor, Provost and Ballingy Professor of English, to introduce our distinguished guest, speaker Dr. Danielle Allen.
Thank you, President Dudley, and welcome all. Each of us has our intellectual heroes, and Danielle Allen has long been one of mine. I first met Dr. Allen when our colleague, Lucas Morel, brought her to campus 15 years ago for our first Ralph Ellison Symposium in 2002. There, she delivered a talk that eventually became one of the finest essays I've read on Ellison, titled Ralph Ellison on the Tragi-Comedy of Citizenship. And there she explains Ellison's view that democratic citizenship requires sacrifice, and that we both weep and rejoice at the simultaneously grand promises of America and the often bitterly disappointing failure to live up to those promises. This is what Ellison famously called the American Contradiction. In her many books, essays, op-eds, and other writings, Danielle Allen constantly returns to this focus on democratic citizenship and what it demands of us, the sacrifices and also the opportunities that the American experiment affords us all. Danielle Allen took her undergraduate degree at Princeton, then went to Cambridge University on a Marshall Fellowship to complete her master's and PhD in classics. She then went to Harvard and earned another master's and PhD in government. This dual expertise in the classical world and the domain of politics and government unifies all of Allen's writings. She's taught at the University of Chicago, the Institute for Advanced Studies at Princeton, and now at Harvard, where she holds the James Bryant Conant University Professorship, Harvard's highest faculty honor, and serves as director of Harvard's Edmond J. Safra Center for Ethics. The honors and awards Dr. Allen has received are vast and testament to both the depth of her intellectual work and the scope of her interests. She is truly a public intellectual in the sense of that rare person who devotes her intellectual energy and creativity to the welfare of the polity, to the public good. Her writings attest to this effort. She has published such books as The World of Prometheus, The Politics of Punishing in Democratic Athens, Talking to Strangers, Anxieties of Citizenship since Brown versus the Board of Education, Why Plato Wrote, Our Declaration, a reading of the Declaration of Independence in Defense of Equality, the text that our community has read and studied together. From Voice to Influence, Understanding Citizenship in a Digital Age, Education and Equality, and just this month, Cuz, a memoir of her younger cousin and his agon with the American crucible of crime, prison, race, and tragedy. What do these works have in common? Justice, citizenship, equality, responsibility, difference, and how difference can coexist with the demands of democracy. In effect, she is herself the answer to the question posed by her own book, Why Plato Wrote. The answer, she tells us, is because a philosopher's ideas can influence her society. That's the answer to why Danielle Allen writes. Had she never written Our Declaration, I think I'd have tried to bring her to campus anyway and have all of our first years read her remarkable book, Talking to Strangers. There she makes the startling but accurate claim that, quote, democracy depends upon trustful talk among strangers. Democracy depends upon trustful talk among strangers. It sounds obvious, but oh so hard to do. She anatomizes what she calls the distorting effects of distrust and concludes that friendship is not an emotion, but a practice. And friendship is not easy, nor is democracy. I think Ralph Ellison would have agreed. These are troubled times in higher education, troubled times for the American experiment, troubled times for democracy. The need for intellectual leadership has never been more acute. And in these times, I am grateful indeed that we have thinkers like Danielle Allen showing us the way. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Danielle Allen.
Good evening. Class of 2021 can do better than that. Good evening.
Good evening.
Thank you. It is a pleasure and honor to be here. Thank you, President Dudley, Provost Connor, extraordinary welcome and introduction, and Dr. Lynch, what beautiful melodies and harmonies. Thank you so much. Every time I come to Washington and Lee, I learn something more about your extraordinary community. Is it true? You go to class at 8 a.m.? Really?
Oh, yes.
Wow. I'm taking that piece of information home with me. That's really something. Congratulations to you for maintaining that degree of seriousness. I'm serious. Congratulations. It's an honor and a privilege to be here with you this evening. It's a privilege because, like President Dudley, I love the start of school. I went to school when I was 4 for kindergarten, and I've basically never left. And he pretty much revealed the reason some of us get hooked on schools, because we get to dress up. Okay, I'm not kidding. Why did I end up as a professor? Because I love the outfit. And the only time I get to wear it is on Convocation. So thank you for inviting me. It's an honor and privilege also simply to have been read by all of you. To be an author is one of the world's greatest luxuries. The reason it's such a luxury is because each of us, day in and day out, is fighting to be known, to be visible to others. And when you write a book and somebody reads it, you've been seen, you've been heard. You all have the rhythms of my voice in your head. You have the currents of my thought. And so I just want to say thank you in the first instance for taking the time to read me. That's an incredible gift you've given me. So you know me now, actually. I wish I knew all of you the way you know me. I won't have that chance, but I hope I'll get to talk to some of you. And when you read my book and followed my argument, you were learning about who I am. I also, in this book, took the time to introduce myself to you at the beginning of the book with a section of memoir. Now, that wasn't strictly speaking necessary. I might have just made my arguments, and in making my arguments, you already would have come to know me. And every paper that you write over the course of your journey here at Washington and Lee will be an opportunity for you to make yourself visible through your arguments to your teachers and your fellow students. And that's important to recognize because it means one of the core jobs you have ahead of you is to own your own ideas, not to repeat things you've heard from others, cliches, fragments of language, cobble together bits of argument that you may have picked up here or there. It's to commit to your own view on a question, and thereby to display yourself in the wholeness of your person to other members of your community. This is not an easy thing to do. There's vulnerability that comes with that, but that is part of the intellectual growth and learning that you're being asked to do over the coming 4 years. But as I said, it's not strictly necessary for me to have started with a memoir. Argument enough is enough to display ourselves to one another. So why did I do that? Why did I start out with that passage about my childhood, about my teaching, and so forth, about my early conversations with my family? I did that because I sought to be not only an author, to make myself known to you as an author, but also to be a democratic author. And it's that concept I want to talk to you about today, what it means to be a democratic author, to write for democracy as part of a democracy. Your journey here, your adventure at Washington and Lee is about becoming democratic authors, and your education should support that. I'll say more about that in a minute, but what I want to do now is just to dig into this question of what it means to be a democratic author. And you'll have noticed in my book, right, like some 300 pages, about 1,300 words. It's like the ratio there is slightly embarrassing. You'll have noticed that I do repeat myself some, all right? And so in talking to you about what it means to be a democratic author, I'm going to repeat myself again. I'm going to share again some of the arguments that you saw in the book. The easiest way to do that is to begin with the crux of the matter. You probably know it by heart now too. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principle and organizing its power in such form as to them, which means all of you, shall seem most likely to effect their safety and happiness. Now that sentence is an invitation. I hope you noticed that it's an invitation. And what precisely is it an invitation to? It's an invitation, of course, to judge. That final clause, whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people. Well, how do you know when this right is active? Only by judging, by diagnosing the situation around you, by diagnosing your circumstances. And you're invited to make a judgment, and then if you judge that the world requires alteration, the government around you requires alteration, you were invited to do what? Excuse me? To institute, to alter, abolish, to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principle and organizing its power in such form. You are invited to use principles and organizational form together to try to improve the state of affairs around you. Thank you for those of you who gave the words back to me. Thank you. I appreciate that. All right, so that's what it means to be a democratic author. It's to speak with others, to work on the collective project of defining the safety and happiness that we can achieve together with respect to a combination of principles and organizational form. All right? And so that sentence is inviting each and every one of us to be a democratic author in that way. All right? And so that's what I did for you in the book. I made a contribution to our democratic conversation. I said to you in this book, we need in our country to recover a conversation about equality. And we can do that by digging into one of the key resources of our own tradition, the Declaration of Independence. Okay, so I was making two arguments there for you. One about the value of the concept of equality, and the other about the value of our tradition, the Declaration of Independence, as a resource for digging into that. Now, anytime somebody tells you they're talking to you about equality, you should stop them and say, wait a second. What do you mean exactly? Do you mean political equality? Do you mean human moral equality? Do you mean social equality? Do you mean something economic egalitarianism, economic justice, racial equality, gender equality? What do you mean? So let me tell you. In my book, I focus on the combination of human moral equality, political equality, and social equality. That's what the Declaration focuses on. That cluster of concepts has consequences for how we think about other issues, economic issues, issues of gender, issues of race. But in the Declaration, what we get about equality is about political equality, human moral equality, and social equality, all right? And I made an argument to you in the book that understanding those concepts, those elements of equality, would be beneficial, salutary, healthy, health-bringing, health-giving to our contemporary democratic conversation, all right? So I, as a democratic author, was saying to each and every one of you, hear me. Listen to me. Take this into the conversation as you think about your democracy, as you make your diagnoses and judgments about where we are in our contemporary circumstances and what collectively we should do about them. All right, so I took the invitation from the Declaration and I responded to it by making this proffer to all of you. I invited you into the conversation. But that doesn't explain yet why I thought I had to introduce myself to you. So let me go ahead and explain that. Now, if I had just presented my argument about equality, Although you would have felt the rhythms of my voice, you would have experienced it to some extent as a sort of disembodied articulation from on high of what we should do. And what would be my basis for offering such an argument? On what grounds would I do that? There are some people who would make such an offer on the basis of, for example, a theological argument. So that it's because of the laws of God that we should do this. And I was not making that kind of argument. There are some people who would have, for example, made the argument about what we should do on the basis of universal reason. Say if some people was a student of Kant, the philosopher Kant, for example. And I wasn't doing that either. I was making my argument instead on the basis of the capacity of democratic citizens to judge together about their principles. And that means I have to show you who I am. Who is it? And on the basis of what motivations and experiences am I putting these principles forward for your consideration and your engagement? Now, there's another issue here too. So you may have noticed in my book that I draw a target around the concept of libertarianism. Some of you may have experienced that as, in some sense, put it in sort of dramatic terms, existentially threatening. Like, what? I'm a libertarian. She's talking about me? What does that mean? Right? Now, I owe it to you to show you who I am. I owe it to you to prove myself trustworthy. I may think that libertarianism, as a very extreme account of the place of liberty in our society in a way that puts liberty and equality into tension with each other, is erroneous. All right? But I want to make that case to you, and I want to convince you of that. And as a part of displaying to you my good intentions, my desire to seek what's best for our common community, I'm going to prove myself trustworthy. And so I am going to open up myself, my person, and expose it to view, again, for your consideration and judgment. I am making myself vulnerable before you by doing that, and that is an act of proving myself trustworthy, whose purpose is also to cultivate trust in a community. All right, so that's one thing a democratic author has to do. Pay attention to the points when her views may make other people feel under attack, threatened, vulnerable. And she needs to prove herself trustworthy to those people too. So another feature of my being a democratic author, you may have noticed the complicated passage about Thomas Jefferson in the book. Right? The sort of working through the question of how should we think about Thomas Jefferson? How should we think about the passages that he wrote that were about people in Africa having sacred rights of life and liberty and therefore being equal to the people in the colonies who also had sacred rights? How should we reconcile that with the fact that he held slaves, that he defended slavery as a system, that in notes on the state of Virginia, he had all kinds of things to say about the black residents of his colony and then state. So I wrestle with this question because I'm trying to understand how Jefferson could make a mistake. I judge him to have made a mistake. And I need to understand why he made the mistake because, after all, I'm claiming that this American tradition is beneficial, that we can get good out of it. And yet there's also plainly bad in the American tradition. And I have to be honest about that. And some of that bad is bad that makes me feel not particularly good myself. So I don't like reading the negative things that Jefferson had to say about Black Americans, for example. Yet in the face of those challenges to my own full humanity, I have the responsibility to practice resilience. And how do I practice resilience? I dig into the mistake. I understand Jefferson and why he made the mistake. And by virtue of understanding Jefferson's mistake, I can seek to correct it, to improve on it, to take lessons for a broader community that transcend where he got to. So what was Jefferson's mistake? He did not connect ideas to habits. Lots of reasons not that he didn't. As I write in the book, could be self-interest, it could have been a certain kind of laziness, it could have been simply the hold that habit has on us. So what lesson do I take from that about correcting Jefferson's mistake? It forces me to scrutinize my habits. A sort of daily practice of trying to find the places where my habits may be doing damage or harm to somebody. and to hold myself to a higher standard for bringing my principles and commitments, bring my habits in line with my principles and commitments. All right? So there's a second feature there of being a democratic author. In the first instance, I've got to prove myself trustworthy. In the second instance, I need myself to develop a practice of resilience to deal with all those moments in the democratic conversation where there'll be what feels like an incoming threat. All right? And I can be resilient, and I can have answers for those moments. So the third feature of being a democratic author comes out from the challenge of the compromises in the Declaration. I don't talk about this one as much as does in the book, so this is a little extending beyond what's in the book. So there are two key compromises in the book, right? One about religion and the other about slavery. The religion compromise comes in the language of the creator, the divine providence, the supreme judge, so forth. All terms that indicate a commitment to a higher power, a notion of a higher power, but that do not, in fact, convey any specific doctrinal position, religious position, or theological position. The point of that compromise language was to let a lot of people who disagreed about matters of religion nonetheless sign on to a shared project, right? And that seems like a very healthy, salutary compromise, one that we still benefit from and could benefit from going forward. The slavery compromise is a different matter, of course, right? Because at the end of the day, we think of the compromises that this country made around slavery as being a fatal flaw. One of the things that have caused this country the most pain and difficulty. The pain and tragedy and loss of the Civil War, the pain of slavery in the period from the Constitution till the end of the Civil War, the pain of Jim Crow, all those things come together as a result of the fatal flaw, the tragedy of the compromise over slavery. And let me just remind you where the compromise comes in the Declaration. It comes in two places. There's the moment when Jefferson's language about the distant Africans having sacred rights of life and liberty, when that gets cut out, that's a pro-slavery moment. And then there's the phrase life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which was an anti-slavery moment. Let me explain this one because it's not in the book. As I said, this is stuff I learned after I finished the book. You keep working, you write a book and you're never done. It keeps going, all right? So in the fall of 1775, the British governor, Lord Dunmore of Virginia, declared that any slave who escaped from a Virginian plantation to fight for the British would be free. This radicalized Virginians. This was what brought Virginians to the side of independence, this threat to the institution of slavery. And Virginians began making the argument that Britain was violating their rights of property. So from the fall of 1775, the right of property became connected in the colonial political arguments to a defense of slavery. In the North, there were already those who considered slavery a problem. John Adams, also Benjamin Franklin. The discussions about a right to property were beginning to break up and fragment the debates they were having in Continental Congress. John Adams proposed alternative language, happiness, as a way of articulating the objects and ends of government. And you can see over the course of the months between the fall and the July of 1776, the development of this compromise language. So when George Mason writes the Virginia Declaration of Rights, he uses both the traditional property language and the new happiness language. He talks about the need to have rights that are about acquiring and securing property and also pursuing happiness. So he puts both things together. But then by the time we get to the Declaration, the property concept is gone. And just at the point when they are working on the Declaration, they're having debates over the Articles of Confederation as well. And Benjamin Franklin, in a stretch of the debate, when the property concept comes up, says, look, this is about slavery, this triggers the slavery debate, and we need to just put that to the side. We can't address that now. So that's a way you can see that the removal of the property concept was about achieving a compromise. The language pursuit of happiness permitted both North and South to think that their understanding of what was proper to government was encapsulated by the Declaration. Now, we can have lots of conversations about whether a compromise was pragmatically necessary, but at this point, a whole heck of a lot of us, pretty much all of us, pretty nearly, believe that that was a moral failure. That moment of compromise that protected slavery was a moral failure. This is hard for us as Americans because democracies depend on compromise. You cannot operate a democracy without compromise, by definition, because There's always a vote. Somebody wins and somebody loses. And the losers have to be willing to keep playing. And if there's never any give, and if it doesn't go back and forth, the thing breaks. You cannot run a democracy without compromise. Yet, because we have this horrible beginning compromise around slavery, we're all worried about compromise. We're all worried that we will be committing another sort of moral failure when we compromise. So, in order to be democratic authors, to contribute to a conversation where we do need compromise, we have to be able to distinguish between good compromises and bad compromises. And how do we make that distinction? As I've wrestled with this question, the answer that I've come to in thinking about the Declaration is that the religious compromise succeeded because it was all-inclusive. It touched on all the varieties of religious experience then present in colonial America. The slavery compromise, on the other hand, did not incorporate the voice and perspective of enslaved people. That's why it failed morally. So the third responsibility of democratic authors is to ensure that when they're making a contribution to the democratic conversation, when they're working with others to chart a path forward, they include all affected. They look to make sure that the voices of all affected are a part of the conversation. That's the check on compromise, including the voices of all affected. All right? So I'm inviting you into the work of being a democratic author today, and I'm suggesting to you that that work has these three responsibilities: proving yourself trustworthy, practicing resilience, and being all-inclusive in the conversation, ensuring that the voices of all affected are part of deliberations. Your education should help you, equip you to do this. Your study of history, your study of philosophy, your study of sociology should give you the resources that you need to understand our human world. But above all, this work that I've described is work that we do with our voices, with words, with language. It's a muscle, our use of language, just like our biceps, quadriceps, whatever. Our voice, our language is a muscle. It requires exercise and practice, as hard and vigorous as the practice you bring to the cross-country team, to the football team, to field hockey, to soccer. And that's why I asked you in my book to read slowly, because that is exercising your muscle of language, helping you see the value of precise expression, because that's the tool necessary for talking as democratic authors in the way that I've been describing. Now, this invitation to you to be democratic authors pertains not just to your bigger communities, the US or your home country or a global community. It also pertains here on campus at Washington and Lee. This is a complicated time in this country. You're at the center of debates, for example, about symbols, the name of one of your founders or one of your forefathers, Washington founder, Lee forefather. So you are already in a democratic conversation. You are authors here on this campus of the community that you're making together. Now, if I had a magic wand and I could just gift you something, I would gift you a name change. And it would be a change to Chavis, Washington and Lee. A community that recognizes itself as having been the first in the country to award a degree to an African-American undergraduate. Wow! That is an astonishing inheritance, an astonishing heritage. Lift it up proudly. But I don't have a magic wand. I can't gift you any such thing like that. So I know that instead, you will be here over the next 4 years as the country as a whole is debating the hard question of how communities take responsibility for their own symbols, and you too on this campus will be having those debates. And so all I can do is try to gift you, by way of example, these three resources for democratic conversation and authorship I've been describing. Commit to proving yourself trustworthy. Commit to developing the habits and practices of resilience. Commit to including all voices in the conversation and the deliberation. You will be doing fundamental work if you do that. You will be achieving your own education. Welcome to your Washington and Lee.
Thank you, Professor Allen. May I ask everyone to stand for the Washington and Lee hymn? Thank you, University Singers. Please remain standing. I want to close very briefly by reiterating what I said at the outset. We are here to do important work, which we can only do together. We are privileged to serve a noble mission to which each of us makes distinctive contributions. This can sometimes get forgotten in the bustle of our daily routines, but I urge you to remember that what we do here matters, and doing it well should bring you a deep and deserved sense of satisfaction. I'd like to thank VMI for graciously allowing us to use Marshall Hall. I would like to thank the class of 1942, whose generous gift supports this convocation each year. And I'd like to thank Dining Services for the meal that awaits us. To accommodate everyone most efficiently, we encourage first-year students, along with faculty and staff, to please go to Evans Dining Hall, and all others, please proceed to the marketplace to enjoy the buffet. With that, and in my formal capacity as the president of Washington and Lee, I officially open the 2017-2018 academic year. May it be a good one for all of you. We are adjourned.